Okay, hello everyone. I am Nick Kemlar and I'm joined by Philip Kruger. And today we're going to talk about an article by W. Puck Brecher called Eccentricity as Ideology, Biographies of Meiji Kijin. Eccentrics in Japanese Kijin are characterized by their unusual behavior, which is often either revered or despised. In the Meiji period, a time of immense social change, we can see a shifting reinterpretation of this term in the biographical anthologies of Meiji eccentrics. In the beginning, eccentrics were considered troublesome and obstructive of the early Meiji progressionist project, but they were later reclaimed as symbolic of archetypal national values and social knowledge. Biography was instrumental in reframing the symbolic utility of Kijin in Meiji society. So we'll first begin with some definitions. Kijin means eccentric, whilst Kyojin means a mad person. And eccentricity is not synonymous with madness, but they're not entirely inseparable. And eccentricity generally describes a person who is non-conformist in attitude, with unusual behavior, unconventional lifestyle, and opinion. Eccentricity has been branded both genius and madness.
Okay, so before we go into the various depictions and ideals of Kijin, it's important to know in what kind of historical context we are operating in here in early Meiji. So Uchida Roan wrote some insightful points in this regard, reviewing the social tensions of the mid-1880s. First of all, as well as in education as social discourse in general, science and politics played a major role. Meanwhile, literature and philosophy weren't an object of teaching or praise at all. They were seen as shameful, frivolous amusements, unsuitable for public consumption. As such, those who engaged in literature or philosophy played very marginal roles in society and did not enjoy much success.
So apart from Uchida Roan's insight, there are a few other things we need to take note of. One of them being Bunmei Kaika, which is, in other words, Japan's westernization, especially in regard to the sciences and a more production-focused society, can be seen as it can be seen as responsible for putting writers in this sort of loser category. That is, the climate created by Bunmei Kaika promoted nation-focused utilitarianism and productivity in a rather direct conceptual sense, which was conflicting with the lifestyles of those who were attached to the aesthetics of pre-Meiji times. This is where we also see an admiration for perseverance in perfection through repetition rather than raw genius or ability.
So this meant that humor was also a very touchy subject and even led to arrests, as we will later see. And instead, we had ideals like Rishin Shuse, so rising up in the world, accumulating status, fame, capital, a kind of class mobility, which of course also meant that great shame for those who didn't rise in society and that individualism and, say, abstract creativity was neutralized.
Then we, of course, have the founding figures of the Meiji state, like Fukuzawa Yukichi, and he's also known as the man on the 10,000 yen note. He wasn't too keen on non-conformity, which obviously didn't bode well for our Kijin.
And if Kijin or Kyojin did appear in print, they certainly weren't put into a positive context. So often depicted as elderly, solitary, antisocial, physically deformed, misfits, troublemakers, so those whose antics required police intervention, and dropouts unwilling or unable to adjust to Meiji society. So the satirical painter Kawanabe Kyosai is not a bad example for such a Kijin. At a calligraphy and painting party in 1987, he painted figures putting shoes on a man from the fictitious Ashinaga Island, the long-legged island, and a man from Tenaga Island, so long-armed island, plucking the nose hairs from a great Buddha. So these Ashinaga and Tenaga figures are traditional yokai, but long arms and legs were also recognized markers of Western foreigners. Consequently, authorities interpreted these drawings as parodies of the newly formed Meiji state's weakness before the foreign powers. As a result, Kyosai was arrested and imprisoned for 50 days. He then changed the character Kyo in his name from Mad to Dawn.
So this picture that we've got here is not the one just described. It's kind of difficult to dig up these things. It's a very specific article, but you can kind of imagine it being in this sort of style. In this picture, we can see an Ashinaga Kozo, which is a long-legged brat who's engaged in some kind of mischief. It looks maybe like he's shaving his head or something. You can leave your interpretations in the comments, of course. So now we'll go on to the actual biographies themselves. And firstly, we have Jono Takashige's Wayo Kijin-den, which was the first biographical anthology of Meiji Kijin published in 1872. And what was significant about this publication was that it challenged the existing public opinion of Kijin as being morally reprehensible and aligned the term with Meiji ideals. It did this by presenting famous luminaries, whether scholars, artists, explorers, etc., both Japanese and foreign, and placing them side by side on a page.
So this kind of formatting was reflective of the purpose of the biography, which was to emphasize a sort of spiritual or scientific dichotomy between native and foreign cultural influences. Here, the term Kijin served as a device to position Japan alongside Western countries in terms of its cultural development, which was significant given the anxiety at the time about Japanese inferiority in the face of Western influence.
Additionally, by aligning the term Kijin with celebrity, he asserted Kijin as a term associated with notions of advancement, hard work, and self-help, which were obviously characteristic of Bunmei Kaika, or the progressionist ideology of the time.
So here we have a quote taken from the book, which goes as follows. Western countries have long sung the praises of civilization, while our country has practiced national isolation and exclusion. How can the two be compared? Though our country, grounded in the wisdom of nature, possesses no such knowledge and thus remains a child, we do not echo rumors spread by long legs and long arms from the soulless Western countries. In the future, we must learn their languages, and after we have struggled for some 20 years, we too will have railroads and steam locomotives. Nobody will claim that we cannot develop.
So through the Wayo Kijin, then, we can see a development in the term Kijin. In 1884, Sanokita took this new definition and relocated it within Meiji merchant culture. Although they were not always considered especially important, merchants' proximity to art and literature positioned them as purveyors of Meiji culture and in turn important figures in the Meiji project. Focusing on merchants, Sano asserted that an eccentric need not be bold, but they must possess difference. They needn't be limited to artists and explorers who pushed conceptual and physical boundaries. In fact, for Sano, professional achievement and or business prowess was the most reverential factor in defining an eccentric.
Among these eccentrics that he discusses is Iwaya Matsuhei. He was a legendary Ginza businessman who became notorious for his claim that he would trade in anything. Although there was a heavy dose of skepticism about him, he did turn out to be an incredibly successful businessman, weathering recessions and exploiting national affairs to his own advantage. Both Jono and Sano's works present model citizens, accomplished and revered individuals who fit within the ideology of the Meiji project.
So in late Meiji, we can see quite a shift in the perception of Kijin. By 1890, the term Bunmeibyo, which approximately translates to civilization disease, had become commonplace in mainstream expressions and public discourse. This kind of indicated a growing skepticism of Bunmei as the goal and process of Meiji society.
And we can also observe a conflict between mid-Meiji Japan as a modern nation state and social controls. So that is to say, in 1890, Japan established a representative government. From 95 onward, overseas colonies were acquired, and in 1899, Japan was finally rejecting the unequal treaties made with Western nations. All these developments increased Japan's international credibility as a modern nation. Yet, social controls, which limited public interest groups as well as a general government monitoring of civil society and its discourse, worked against this modern image.
There was another dichotomy between the humanism of Confucianism and Western utilitarianism. For example, rationalism's inability to tend to the spiritual and the brand of commercialism and elitism promoted by Rishin Shusei were perceived as obstacles to the pursuit of individual happiness. This further fueled the skepticism against Bunmei.
At this point, we can even speak of hibunmei, that is, anti-civilization. The disapproval of the national bunmei program therefore generated an interest in behavioral eccentricity. And more interestingly, for our object of study, wider disparities in its biographical application.
So within this context of late Meiji Kijin, Miyazaki Torazo, who wrote under the pen name Miyazaki Toten, is a good example for interest in eccentricity. In his 1902 work Kyojindan, or Discussions of Mad People, we find him wanting to recover Kyojin as potentially messianic individuals, an endeavor rooted in the Confucianist view of the mad or as an enlightened being.
But not only that, it also evokes the literary trope of the failed hero whose moral righteousness is ill-suited to the corruption of contemporary society. Now, if that doesn't remind us of Natsume Soseki's Botchan, then I don't know what does, which, by the way, was published 4 years later in 1906. So we can kind of see this idea seeping into the mainstream quite effectively.
So to give a quote from Miyazaki, Kyojin laugh mischievously at the world, endeavoring to execute a master plan of easing universal grief and anxiety through the noble causes of freedom, equality, and philanthropy. They stand as allies of the masses by overturning the foundations of country and society and attempting to create a heaven on earth. But there are none who have succeeded in this. From a current perspective, this might somewhat sound like a naive characterization of a socialist. But what is important to note here is that reclaiming individuality and deviance as something potentially valuable or even virtuous. Also, the aspect of not succeeding in one's endeavors.
Beyond just valuing deviance, Miyazaki actually calls common sense, that is, in his characterization, the balance of feeling, knowledge, and will, mediocrity. And not only those who feel, and only those who feel excessively have the potential to succeed or fail. Those who succeed being the great people of society, and those who fail being mad or kyojin.
That being said, we also need to note that the cure from kyojin became more and more associated with medical terms and mental illness through ideas in psychology from the 1870s onwards. And Miyazaki also acknowledges this in his writing.
So, Sakai Wakachi's contribution to Kijin biographies in 1903 is reminiscent of the publications of Jono and Sanno. Meiji Kijin then reclaims the concept of Kijin along nativist lines, framing real Kijin as not especially strange or unusual, but nevertheless accomplished and worthy of recognition. His Kijin are morally righteous and protective of traditional nativist pursuits. It comes as little surprise that many of Sakai's Kijin are accomplished scholars and proponents of Kokugaku. Sakai makes a distinction between morally righteous, noble patriots and misfits and oddballs who, according to him, are like entertainers chasing after fame and fortune, following the bright light of modernity.
Here are a few examples from Sakai's anthology. Firstly, we have Miyatake Gaikotsu, who Sakai claims was a warrior of justice with a propensity for strangeness and an enjoyment of causing mischief. His publications include satirical stabs at the Meiji Constitution, scathing pieces about political, police, and media corruption, And all these actions either landed him in prison, fined, or censored, but they did little to stop his behavior.
And then we have Komai Chikafusa, who was a through-and-through Japanese nativist, a former Bakufu official who denounced the excesses of Meiji society, extolling the virtues of traditional lifestyles in his essays. He was notorious for berating progressionist university professors.
Hattori Tokuko had a somewhat tragic life. She was born into a life of few opportunities, and despite being deprived of a formal education, she taught herself to read and write, eventually becoming a renowned waka poet. Supposedly beautiful and graceful, her fame and accomplishment as a poet led to jealousy and public condemnation from her rivals. And the whole thing became a bit too much for her, and she abandoned poetry. But despite her aversion to marriage, or, quote, the normal life of a woman, she eventually married, tragically becoming bedridden only a year and a half later.
Now, finally, Saito Torao was a martial arts expert exposed to the negative view of Japanese people through his travels in America and Canada. And apparently, he, quote, impressed a ship's captain and crew with a martial arts display, to which the captain remarked, quote, "You are a true Japanese." But the legitimacy of this claim is disputable.
But at any rate, Sakai's eccentrics are unceasingly loyal to the nativist movement, determined and educated, the sort of activists and traditionalists that would have been styled losers a generation earlier. And despite their vilification and censoring, Sakai holds them up as winners, whose strangeness is remedial to the supposed sickness of contemporary Meiji society. And to quote Brecher, Sakai's Kijin are social saviors, not Taoist dropouts, and their antisocial behavior is to be read as political dissent. As conservationists playing a purifying social role, his eccentrics bring the morality of a superior past to a degenerate present.
Okay, then let's talk about Shiba Sojo's Kijin. So, like Miyazaki, Shiba Sojo also sought to recover the utility of abnormalcy in an increasingly normal society. He also aligns with Miyazaki's opinions on medical illness, believing that diagnosis legitimizes eccentricity as a mental derangement, something that needs to be treated. Shiba asserts that greatness emerges from madness, and that silliness is important for nurturing human potential.
Shiba believed that the, quote, parameters of humanity are rendered infinite by madness, noting that cure is limited by our own imagination, and calls generally for a reconsideration of normalcy and the popular obsessions of money, status, pleasure, and advancement. He believed, quote, the eccentric illuminates the nature of the centric.
Okay, so somewhat similar to Shiba's work, we find Jinbutsu Hyoron Kijin Seijin, or A Critique of Personality, the Eccentric and the Upright, published by Toyama Jusei in 1912. What characterized this work is that Kijin are portrayed as inherently correct beings, embodiments of social knowledge who guide the people. And a lot of this was sort of derived from Buddhist ideals.
As such, most of Toyama's Kijin are not at all the losers we saw in early Meiji, but actually politicians, doctors, lawyers, and business people who were characterized by their strength and their opinions. In other terms, they are social winners who've helped to create a strong modern state. And the key from Kijin in Toyama's work is not only simply an aesthetic, but rather stands for talent, honor, charisma, and success.
Now, in contrast to that, we have Yagi Shosaburo's Ijin to Kijin no Betsu, or Distinguishing Between Heroes and Eccentrics, published in 1912. This work acts as a sort of rebuttal to Shiba's, in that it shares similar themes but differs strongly in its conclusion. For Yagi, Kijin are neither great nor heroic, but rather a sort of clown who exists for the amusement of others. He says that they are inauthentic, lack common sense, are selfish, have no regard for the benefit of the public, and bluntly put, are just disease. We can therefore clearly see that the discourse on Kijin was by no means a unanimous one, even in late Meiji.
So, wrapping things up, we talked about historical context in early Meiji before, but now we're going to review the social context after this transformation of Kijin and Kyojin. Whilst the collapse of an idealized political cause, Bunmei, and broader application of Western science and religion brought conflict, they also helped revive a measure of tolerance for strangeness. And so out of that, there evolved a new literary discourse on individualism and its relation to the Bunmei doctrine.
Now, late Meiji Kijin writers were more set on addressing public discourse and contemporary political issues, thereby formulating eccentricity as a symbol for national pride.
And in these biographies, we therefore find an interesting contrast of eccentrics as individualists who live in their own worlds, but also engaged in this world as proponents of national interest, a sort of countercultural patriotism.
So this idea of Meiji Kijin as symbols of national pride gained enough traction to influence a top 100 Kijin contest by the Yomiuri Shimbun in 1906, which is of course a newspaper. And the winner would receive 100 yen in prize money, which would be approximately $500 if we adjust for inflation and so on. Even the fact that a Kijin could be considered a winner shows that the term has departed from its associations in early Meiji, being a loser. Although the qualifying characteristics of these people were based on their public contributions, patriotism, and ambition.
And so the most eccentric Kijin, according to the Yomiuri Shimbun, was the educator and amateur mineralogist Hoshina Gomusai from Nagano. And here is a description of the man. During the 4 seasons, he wore a straw hat atop a red cloth that he draped over his long matted hair. Carrying his mineralogist's hammer and packing a loudly ticking alarm clock in his breast pocket, he was a picture of eccentricity. He had a habit of delivering slanderous, foul-mouthed public orations to nobody in particular. Once he attempted to enter politics by registering himself in the 1907 general election for the House of Representatives. He received 23 votes, from which he derived great satisfaction.
So, as we can see, Hoshina was, in a way, a departure from the Kijin of Sakai and Toyama. He was not particularly talented nor accomplished, although his role as an educator and even his bid for office positioned him as a patriot. He was more like one of Miyazaki's madmen, an excessively individualistic person whose attempts to change the world failed. His failure was what qualified him as winning the Kijin contest in the first place.
So what are the larger implications or the final takeaway here? Well, as literature diverged from politics towards subjectivity and emotion, as we can observe in Romanticism and Naturalism, the late Meiji Kijin acted as a sort of ideological counter-mechanism to bring the literary discussion back to topical issues and ramification for the nation-state.
The Kijin in these biographies acted as mirrors for the public to exercise self-scrutiny in an over-the-top kind of way, of course. Eccentricity was not just a loser's trait anymore. It became the very mechanism which transmitted national values as social knowledge.
And the idea of the narcissist eccentric living in entirely his own bubble was dispensed with. And so for late Meiji biographers, deviance of the term Kijin was not exercised for its own sake, but in a patriotic sense. They shouldered the Meiji program and legitimized its polity, which tried to frame them as rampant individualists, thereby neutralizing eccentricity.
Okay, well, thank you for making it this far. As this has already turned out quite long, we will link all the sources in the video description and leave some discussion questions in the comments for you to engage with. Thank you very much.